What's up, Bucs fans? Welcome back to another edition of the Pirate Parlay, brought to you by the Sick Podcast Network. We had another amazing interview this week with Buccaneers defensive back Christian Izien coming on, breaking down what it's been like for his rookie year so far, getting to know him a little bit more and getting some insights on his thoughts on the defense and how his season's been. It was a blast talking to him. We got plenty more players and coaches coming our way, but this week, you know what time it is. It's time to go behind enemy lines and get a little scouting report on our next opponent for the Buccaneers. We're going to bring him in here shortly. He's Will McFadden, writer for the Falcoholic and host of the Believe in Falcons podcast. Got to give it up to the Believe podcast guys coming in here and giving us insightful knowledge every week. With that being said, we'll be right back with him.
Turn up your volume. Because you're about to listen to the Sick Podcast. Pirate Parlay.
Battle intercepted, picked off in the end zone. Bucs are going to beat the Chiefs. We're the champions of the world.
The sickest Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. It's going to be sick.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another edition of the Pirate Parlay here on the Sick Podcast Network. I teased him before the break. We're going to bring him in here. His name is Will McFadden, again, writer for the Falcoholic and also podcast host and Believe in Falcons. I think you're with are you still with Avi there or?
Yeah, Ovi.
Ovi.
Former Falcons fullback and a fullback for the Baltimore Ravens. So yeah.
That's always fun to have that player's insight. Last week we had Glover Quinn, who's part of the Believe Network for the Lions. He came on and gave us that player insight, as someone who's kind of in the podcast realm. So that was a lot of fun. Speaking about a lot of fun, so far it's been up and down season for the Falcons. There's been some highs and some lows on that roller coaster ride. And sitting in that front seat is Desmond Ridder. He's had some good games, had some bad games. Last week would constitute as a bad game, 3 interceptions. What is the thought on Desmond Ridder? Not only just coming into this game, but at the season and as a potential long-term answer at quarterback for the Falcons.
Well, I believe it was Matt Ryan in a piece today with Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, he covered the game last week, the last Falcons game against the Commanders. And he spoke with Jeff, who's a longtime columnist here in Atlanta, and basically said he feels the next 6 games are going to decide Desmond Ridder's kind of future, his long-term future here in Atlanta. And that makes a lot of sense. It starts with obviously a big division road game and a big bounce back game that the Falcons need to have. But likewise with Tampa Bay, which is, spoiler alert, why I am so excited about this matchup. But if you look past the Bucs, there's really some winnable matchups for Atlanta. And if the Falcons can't get through that with Desmond Ridder, then you really have to start to wonder, all right, what conceivable future does he have with this organization? That being said, this past game was clearly a really bad game and maybe one of his worst as a pro. However, the last 2 games in totality, he has shown, a few significant strides as the quarterback of an offense that's able to move the ball through the air. We've heard a lot about teams taking away the run game for Atlanta, and that's been true recently. So the Falcons have had to move the ball through the air. It's part of their evolution or the evolution of their offense. He's been able to do that in ways that we hadn't seen before. So if they can clean up the turnovers, maybe Desmond Ridder can kind of salvage this season and be part of the answer moving forward. But I think a lot of that, the first step of that at least will be determined on Sunday. But the next 6 games, I do agree with Matt, are pretty crucial towards determining that answer.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at a loaded quarterback class coming in here.
Yeah.
And you look at the numbers and it's not terrible. Obviously the rushing game, we knew the rushing attack was going to be solid again. 10th in the league in yards per game there, but passing yards are right in the middle of the pack at 16, putting up around 233 yards a game. Ritter's got 1,300 yards in the season, the 6 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. The ratio is much better before last weekend's game against the Commanders. But, I think when it comes to him, he's still young. I never saw him as like a top tier ever echelon quarterback. I thought he'd be a good game manager, a guy who can win you some games, but a guy who's not going to he's gonna lose you some games, but he's not gonna will a team to victory, right? He's gonna, if he wins the games as a product of the team as a whole doing well, he's not gonna be able to put a team on his back. And you kind of brought in a guy like that too, in Tyler Heineke. I see fans are already screaming for his name after last week's performance, but 3-3 with the chance to potentially take the division with a win against the Buccaneers. What are the expectations coming into this game, and what are the expectations coming to the season for Falcons fans? Was this we all heard all season this division is wide open. What are the thoughts right now after 6 games, and what were the thoughts coming into the season on what the Falcons could potentially do?
Well, I'll start with the season because that kind of informs the thought process going into week 7. But to take you all the way back to 2021 when Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot were hired, looking at the financial landscape at that time, it was pretty clear that the third year was going to be the year that things really were able to come together for Atlanta just because of the financial situation they were in. So the real challenge, Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, they had just given out a lot of kind of big contracts to some of the guys. And the Falcons really have cut bait. Most recently, Jalen Hawkins, who they waived this week, was a former, not a high draft pick, but, mid-round draft pick for the Falcons who had been a starter. And they have moved on from players like him, Michael Walker, Deion Jones in the past. Calvin Ridley was a unique situation, but he was at one point, expected to be the next in that lineage of Roddy White, and then to Julio Jones, and then to Calvin Ridley for a decade. Like, it's just a totally different team. And I commend the staff, and I commend Arthur Smith for 2 7-10 finishes with totally different teams, totally different offenses, and, not a lot of talent on those rosters. But that's why a lot of people penciled this year as kind of the year. All right, you get a big windfall of money to spend in free agency. They chose to spend a lot of that on the defense. We've seen the impact of that decision. The defense has been really good for Atlanta so far this year, but that is also comes with a lot of the expectations, right? Certainly when you accompany that with 3 top 10 draft picks that you used on the offense. So the expectation coming into this season was, compete for the division, but bottom line, you got to make the playoffs. And I think a lot of people, my co-host Ovi Mihaly included, want a playoff plus a win, right? They want the playoff plus package. And that's why going into this weekend, after a loss that truly was the first loss in a while that felt like you snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, because even though the Falcons were playing catch up all throughout that game, they were the better team in the second half, and they had multiple chances late there to significantly eat into the deficit, if not outright overtake the Commanders. Right. So a lot of people this week are kind of, all right, you're 3-3. Are things really going to be different than they've been the last 2 years? This was supposed to be the year. What's up with Arthur Smith? What's up with Desmond Ridder? Why is he our core? It's a lot of the sky may not be quite falling, but like people are looking up and there's cracks in the clouds. That's kind of the mindset right here around Atlanta.
Right. Do you think that's fair with having Ridder at the quarterback helm? I mean, the defense has been good, and we'll get into those numbers here in a little bit. But that's where they did spend a lot of that money that finally freed up. But this is a quarterback league, and going in with a guy who played well towards the end of the last season, but still there's a lot of polish left to be on, worked out on his game. Do you think it's a fair ask for the Falcons to win and won, or do you think that's kind of like the ceiling? What would you put their floor as, after watching, Saints aren't doing too hot right now. We knew the Panthers, anyone who was really watching the NFC South knew the Panthers are still a couple years away from even being competitive, but it was kind of a 3-team race last year. The Falcons, they were right in the thick of things towards the end of the season, 7-10 record. The Bucs only had one more game over them, and they beat the Bucs to give them that losing record. But do you think, what is their ceiling realistically, and do you think it's a fair ask for them to not only win the division and win a playoff game in that wildcard round?
Yeah, coming into the season and just looking at the schedule, I initially, I think, had them at like 12-5, 11-6, somewhere around there. And a lot of that did have to do with the easy schedule on paper, which is still kind of turning out to be a pretty easy schedule. Like they've got Arizona, they've already played Carolina, they play Indianapolis, who now won't have Anthony Richardson. So things aren't absolutely brutal for Atlanta. Tampa Bay is shaping up to be one of the tougher games on the schedule. So from that standpoint, I do think that you can go on to have a successful season. But your question about Desmond Ridder, and it's something I asked Josh Kendall, who covers the Falcons for The Athletic, on my podcast Throwing Up Today. And his answer was kind of, look, the Falcons knew what the importance of year 3, right? Like they were the ones, Arthur Smith, Terry Fontenot, Arthur Blank as well, have said, yeah, like year 3 is when the expectations rise a little bit. They're the ones that chose to go into the season with Desmond Ridder. Now, right. They did pay money to bring Taylor Heineke in here, and I think that he is break glass in case of emergency plan. I just am curious to see how long that rope is, how long that leash is, but it's still early. And I know fans hate to hear that when you are like 3-3, and then what if you're 4-4 and all that, but you can kind of find your momentum. And when you do, I think that things can get on a roll pretty quickly. And certainly when you look at a team like Atlanta, their defense, again, is kind of no joke, playing really well. They have kept them in every single game against some pretty good offenses. And they have done it in a lot of different ways, whether it be interceptions like in week 1. Last week, it was sacks that really kind of kept the Falcons in that game. And that was great to see. But they also are just one of the best third down defenses in the NFL. And that's going to help you stay in a lot of games if you can get the other team off the field. So that's why I am confident if the offense does figure this out, and they have moved the ball really well the last 2 weeks without a lot of contribution from the run game. And I think that's by design. I think they need to back teams off of the box a little bit. They need to, a lot of teams are saying, okay, we need you to show us that you can actually beat us throwing the ball, or else we're just not going to take you seriously. And we're going to line up everybody in the box. Right. So they're doing a good enough job at moving the ball through the air that I think you'll start to see a little bit more balance. And then Atlanta will probably get their run game going, and that'll help Desmond Ridder as well, just as maybe he's gaining the right amount of confidence. So it's early. I know that's a long answer, but I do think they can still salvage this season if they start to find their stride offensively.
You talk about, of course, once teams know, and it really didn't matter last year because teams knew what was coming with the two-headed attack with Algier leading the way last year, and they were still able to kind of impose their will upon teams running the ball. But through the air, Drake London is really the guy. He's about it. For whatever reason, they've started to get him into a rhythm a little bit more. Kyle Pitts, they just haven't been using him the way I think he needs to be utilized, and especially since his rookie year. But outside of Drake London, if you can take him away, how much pressure does that put on Desmond Ridder? We've seen Jonnu Smith kind of have a little bit of resurgence down there, but outside of him, I mean, the next receiver that's even has double digits is Mac Hollins with 12. After that, you're looking at a bunch of guys who haven't even cracked 5 receptions for it's tight ends and Bijan Robinson pretty much outside of Drake London.
Yeah, I mean, you've got in my mind, kind of two different types of offenses right now, at least passing offenses. And one is one that both Bucs and Falcons fans should be very familiar with, and that's kind of the Dirk Cutter offense, right? And when I worked for the Falcons, he was covering Dirk Cutter in his second stint there, and really that's going to feature like 2 wide receivers and a tight end, and those guys are going to get 78% of your target share because they're your best players and you're just going to get them the ball. Then you have a little bit more of kind of the Kyle Shanahan and the Arthur Smith where they can create targets for players that you would never expect to get the ball. And that's kind of part of the design, right? It's your Levine Toilolos or your Michael Pruitts. And that is where even if you take a Drake London away, he could still easily just turn to Kyle Pitts or Jonnu Smith, who, is basically just as good as Kyle Pitts this season. or they've yet to really get Cordero Patterson involved. Bijan is still a prominent feature in the passing game. So there are some main options to go to, but I think the Falcons would be just as comfortable throwing the ball to Kadero Hodge, who is a player who's been here a couple of years, who really kind of operates in that like fourth receiver role, but they do trust him. Mac Hollins, when he's been called upon, has performed really well. They just kind of don't throw him the ball a lot because they don't really throw any one person the ball a lot. And that's been a complaint for not only the Falcons community, but the fantasy football community writ large is, give your good players the ball. And they're starting to do that a little bit more, Drake London being the main recipient of that. But even if you took him away, and the matchup between the secondary for Tampa and Atlanta's receivers, obviously the size you give Atlanta against pretty much any team, but the physicality that Tampa plays with, I'm really, really curious to see that matchup. Really curious to see, Antoine Winfield and just kind of how he moves around. I know he's been so good at blitzing this season, so I think that's going to be a little bit of an X factor. But even success against Drake London, I think the Falcons will find some creative ways to move the football through the air if they have to.
You talk about Drake London. He's notoriously kind of been moved all over the inside, outside, even with that 6'5" frame. Where has he been playing mostly this year? Has he been mostly playing outside? Have they been kind of splitting that evenly? Because you look at if he's outside and he's on Carlton Davis's side, that's going to be a matchup to really watch with the physicality, as you're saying. But if he moves onto the inside, it's a really interesting matchup because Bucs, I just had him on the podcast this week, but Bucs undrafted free agent Christian Izien is their main slot guy. He's 5'8". So there's quite a height difference there between the two. But he's another really physical guy, plays in the mold of Antoine Winfield Jr. I don't want to say he's a clone, but they're pretty similar in playing style. They had the same coach in college, and he's modeled his game after him. And lo and behold, he's playing with him now.
There you go.
So, where has Drake London lined up primarily this season? Has it been more of a split? What's that been like?
I mean, it's been everywhere. And again, that's part of kind of the Falcons design. You say there's 5'8" slot corner. I think there's going to be a pretty heavy dose of Drake London, of Kyle Pitts, of Mac Hollins, like literally any of the Falcons receivers. They can play inside, but part of the reason they're here in Atlanta is because they can also play close to the line of scrimmage and tight and kind of right off tackle and get those leverage blocks that make some of these outside stretch zone run plays really effective for the Falcons, because they almost like to replace these blockers. So they'll have their tight end or a wide receiver get that leverage block on the end, and then they'll kick out maybe their guard, Chris Lindstrom or Caleb McGarry, and almost get them in space and switch. But it's because of the leverage that the wide receiver, who is, giving up 150 pounds, 110 pounds on a defensive end or something, they are able to sustain that block a little bit longer because of that leverage. So there are a lot of creative ways that they use all their players and all their weapons, which is why the Falcons have that inside outside versatility with their receivers. It's mostly for the run game, but then you get that added benefit of being able to find matchups all across the field. And if they need to, they're very comfortable lining Drake London out by the numbers and say, hey, jump balls to the boundary all day, dude. They're also very comfortable lining him, just off of tackle, kind of where you'd have a wing T tight end and having him run a route from there. So they move their guys all around because they want to hunt those matchups, and also because they want to disguise what they're trying to do.
You talked about the run game a few times there. Let's bring it up. Let's finally get to it, because that's what this Falcons team is known for, right? It's that run game. It was potent last year with a combination of Tyler Algier, who I think it was a 4th round pick, or was he a 5th round pick?
Tyler Algier, 5th round pick.
5th round pick, ran for over 1,000 yards on the season. That wasn't enough for the Falcons. They decided they needed more, and they went out and got Bijan Robinson this offseason in the draft. He's been electric so far. Just watching him, I drafted him on my fantasy team, so I know what he's doing week in and week out.
There you go.
He's been. I love what the Falcons are doing with their video clips with the eye in the sky things, because he almost did like a basketball move on one defender with a ball behind his back, brought it back around. But he's been electric in the pass game and in the run game, as we all expected and thought. how has he changed this Falcons offense, and how has he made that run game even better than it was last year?
Yeah, it's how he changes the offense. It's interesting because I don't know if he wholesale has transformed this offense. To me, it's more like a basketball team where now you've got more of a go-to ball handler, where now you've got somebody where you're comfortable with them having the ball in crunch time, or maybe being able to create off the dribble, where
Right.
before you didn't really have that. You were more uh, handcuffed to the person distributing the ball or your scheme, where with Bijan, if it is like 3rd and 4 and everything is covered downfield and you just need to get it to a guy to create a play, before they didn't really have somebody like that. Now they do. And you are starting to see defenses get a little bit of a read on his go-to kind of inside juke dead leg move. So I'm curious if he develops a little bit of a changeup to that. But by and large, even if he doesn't, what he does is still good enough to beat most defenders any given day, because it's just his vision, but combined with the way he gets in and out of cuts and kind of maintains his momentum and maintains his speed. It just feels like he's operating at a little bit of a faster, like he's like 1.25, 1.5 speed on a podcast, right? He's just a little bit faster than everybody else. They are being pretty careful with his usage. So you're seeing Tyler Algier. Yeah, I would expect this to again be the case against Vita Vea and, the big kind of Bucs defensive line that they trot out there. Tyler Algier is probably going to be the hammerhead who's getting the ball inside of these tackles. That's not to say they won't with Bijan. They're just a little bit more creative with how they do that. We've seen some reverse sweeps. We've seen just play designs that open up the space a little bit more, because I think they're trying to be very cognizant of the number of just absolute contact shots that Bijan is going to take. So he gets a lot of the perimeter work. He gets a lot of the work in the passing game. And I think they want to incorporate Cordero Patterson a little bit more to also take some more off of Bijan's plate. Yeah, he's yet
so far.
He's yet to really kind of be incorporated back in the offense. We've seen a little bit more each week, but frankly, not as much as I've been expecting to see each week. So it's hard to tell. But again, he's past his 30s, right? So he is a little bit older. I think the Falcons maybe kind of, if they do have a playoff push in mind, are they kind of getting him slowly worked back into the season, saving his legs, letting him do that, and using kind of their younger guys early, expecting them to be able to go the distance. So it hasn't been the full 3-headed monster that Falcons fans expected coming into the season.
Right.
We've seen Bijan. He looks great. No complaints whatsoever from Falcons fans with how he's played. Tyler Algier is kind of starting to get back into form, but again, with defenses loading the box as much as they have, it is just tough sledding. And then the final piece is Cordero Patterson, who started the year injured and just really hasn't gotten back to his full allotment of snaps yet.
I feel like Algier too is a guy who needs to be fed to really, kind of.
He's a little bit of get him in that lather, like kind of get him going.
Right. Yeah. Bijan is he's so entertaining to watch because, like you said, he's so fluid. I would not be surprised if we find out at some point he's taking like ballet lessons or something like that, because his movements are just, it's so fluid to one way or another way. And it is just so much fun and entertaining to watch. But enough about the offense now. We've talked about it for the majority of this podcast. The defense is what really was revamped, including the defensive coordinator Nielsen coming over from the New Orleans Saints, bringing some of his guys over. David Onyemata was one of the big signings. Calais Campbell was another one of the big signings, but probably the biggest one was Jesse Bates in the secondary back there. Already has 3 interceptions, counts for all the interceptions the Falcons have so far this season, but he's truly a game wrecker. He's got great anticipation and speed to break on the ball, comes down with them as we've seen so far this season. And he's kind of risen to play of everybody else in that secondary. You look at the defense right now. It wasn't too great last year, but this year so far, they're 14th in points per game, only allowing 20. Total yards per game, they're only allowing 278, which is good for 4th. They're doing a lot of that by protecting against the pass. They're 4th in the league against passing yards against with only allowing 179, and then rushing they're right outside the top 10, only allowing just under 100 yards, 99. So at 11th right there. The one spot where this team has not shown improvement from last year is getting after the quarterback. They got solid pressure on them, but they're 28th in the league right now with only 10 sacks on the season. They still cannot get after the quarterback and bring him down, even after bringing a guy like Bud Dupree in too and spending, resources there last year with Arnold at Piketty. That's been an issue for them. But let's talk about the game plan this offseason, bringing those guys in, bringing a new defensive coordinator in, and so far the rewards that they've reaped from making those changes.
Yeah, I think it starts with Ryan Nielsen, right? And a lot of that is versatility that the Falcons want to be able to have on defense. They want a multiple defense that is able to kind of week in and week out have the resources and the knowledge to match what their opponents are going to want to do. But we have also seen a pretty big shift away from the zone coverage that Dan Quinn liked to run here in Atlanta to those pretty tight press man that the Saints for a long time have run, and the Marshawn Lattimore runs pretty well. So that is where you're going to see Jeff Okudah, AJ Terrell, like they're going to be walked up close to the line of scrimmage. You're going to see the safeties move around a lot. They do a lot of pre-snap looks, post-snap changes, and that is, again, part of their versatile design. One of the things that Ryan Nielsen said when he came here to Atlanta that really stuck out to me in his intro press conference was this kind of idea that Arthur Smith has, where in today's league that's very pass happy is kind of, he wants a defense capable of scheming to stop the pass and then having the athletes on hand to defend against the run. So basically, we're going to try to design our defense to first and foremost defend against the pass, which would put your run game at a little bit of a disadvantage. But they feel like they can kind of make up for that with boots on the ground and just, hey, if our guys are just better than your 11 guys and we got dogs, then we trust them to rally and make these tackles and kind of fight off blocks. And you kind of can't argue with the production so far. As you said, the fourth best pass defense in terms of yards allowed per game. I never thought that was going to be the case coming into this season. And again, that may change. It's still very early, but you can't argue with the level of play either. Like that backs it up. And when you're seeing AJ Terrell, it hasn't even really gotten off to the same level of start that he did 2 years ago when he was playing like an all-pro. I know he wasn't, but he played at that level. Yeah, and
still all-pro.
Yeah, I know. It's
still
but
all-pro.
You want that first team.
All right.
And so Jeff Okudah, though, looks like the number 3 overall pick that everybody expected him to be. So he has been a great surprise. So it's not just Jesse Bates, but his influence, Jerry Gray, who is the assistant head coach in charge of the defense, but a long-time defensive coach in this league and does great work with the secondary. He is a big part of this as well. You did mention the pass rush, and the Falcons did have 5 sacks last week, so they matched their season total, but Washington, I think going into that game, was the second worst offense in terms of sacks per pass attempt. And I think now they're dead last after that game. So that tells you a little bit about the opponent. But I liked you added and getting them down, because all season long, the Falcons have been getting pressure against opposing offenses at a really high rate. In fact, they're third in the NFL behind the Chiefs and Bills in pressure rate. So that's kind of been an interesting little formula that they haven't quite figured out yet. They're getting very close. And I think that also is impacting the secondary. So I think those two are tied together, where you are maybe not getting the sacks, but you're getting pressure, you're moving quarterbacks around, and then you've got some pretty tight coverage on the back end. That leads to a lot of these 3 and outs. That leads to sustainable defense kind of over the course of a game, because they are playing pretty interconnectedly. So a lot of that does have to do with the newcomers. David Onyemata is playing really well. Calais Campbell just got his 100th career sack. I mentioned Jeff Okudah, Jesse Bates. Caden Ellis is another player kind of right in the middle there. And with Nate Landman, who is an undrafted guy and kind of a fun story filling in for Troy Anderson. So there's not a lot of superstars on this defense. They're just playing really sound football, kind of like what we've seen in New Orleans for the better part of this last decade. Yeah, they have the household nicknames, they've got the Cam Jordans, they've got the Marshawn's, but the Falcons, similar style out there as well.
You mentioned Caden Ellison. He's one of the guys, I think, with Jesse Bates as well, who they're not household names. People don't know. Not that many defense players are, unless you're like a TJ Watt or Jalen Ramsey or one of these guys. But those guys, both in the top 3 tackles for this team, and they're underrated guys. And you've got a lot of those players on that Falcons defense. And you brought up AJ Terrell too. And last year, not the best of year for him. You go back 2 years ago, as you mentioned, second team All-Pro, first Pro Bowl. What has his play been like, and how has the arrival of someone like Jeff Okudah, who's looking like the guy that many thought he would be when they drafted him, and the addition of Jesse Bates back there, to allow teams to kind of not so much focused solely on him, because he's been that guy that has had a Midge Mod and Mosh Posh of guys across for him the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, AJ Terrell, it's interesting. It almost feels as though when the teams do target him, they've got very specific plays in mind, because he's been a little bit susceptible to not like big plays, but again, it just feels as though he'll have a couple of pass breakups or tight coverage, and then, they got him for a 14-yard first down, and kind of the guy was wide open. So it almost feels as though the plays where it's through the natural progression of the play, he's locked on, he's on it, he's shutting down the flat, he's passing off guys in coverage, he looks smooth, he looks confident. He's always been pretty good in run defense. He is again this year. But there have been just a handful of plays each game where it does look a little bit more like last year. And you're like, okay, well, you were in position there, but you didn't make the play. Or sometimes, okay, that guy had a couple of steps on you. What went wrong there? But by and large, I have not many complaints about AJ Terrell's play so far this season. He looks much closer to that 2021 form than what we saw last year. I do think that I'm curious to see how the balance between targets starts to change, because teams have poked and prodded Jeff Okudah a little bit more in recent weeks. Mm-hmm. And he has played, I think, his 2 best games. Like, I didn't watch him that closely in Detroit, but it feels safe to say kind of like of his career, like he has been just really locked in the last couple of weeks. And that's where I think teams have just not really chosen to throw AJ Terrell's way. They've looked at Jeff Okudah a little bit more, but because he's performing, because he's stepping up. And you also have a guy like D. Alford, who is a former CFL player who the Falcons brought in last year. He did pretty well in a limited role. And now he emerged after a great training camp as the starting inside nickel. And he's given up some touchdowns against some tough matchups, but he's also hung in there against those same tough matchups and played pretty feisty defense. So again, as teams look for ways to kind of go away from AJ Terrell, they're finding some tough room to operate. And that's part of the reason that the Falcons wanted to really upgrade that second corner spot, look for a confident, really feisty and competitive nickel. But then when you add a cerebral type of leader and veteran in Jesse Bates in the back end, I think he handles a lot of the communication. He allows those guys to play fast and free, and really helps them kind of throughout the week. But seeing it all come together, seeing all of those pieces mesh, is really fun. I mean, there have been some moments where, in my opinion, they have gotten lucky and other teams have had opportunities that they've not fully taken advantage of. So that number, the 4th best, if teams were hitting everything and things were all falling their way, it's probably closer to like 9 or 10, but even still, like that's a legit number. And the Falcons are putting themselves in positions to make plays and get lucky. And you really can't ask for more than that. So there's no complaints here whatsoever about the play of the secondary.
We can't go through this podcast without, mentioning the man up front. He's got a few running mates, like we mentioned, Calais Campbell and David Onyemata, but Grady Jarrett is still probably one of the most dominant defensive tackles in the league. His stretch over the last 4 or 5 years has been nothing short of dominant. With his ability to just collapse the pocket as a pass rusher, but also hold stout against the run. What has it been like he's been the only guy there for a while, and he's been doing it all himself. There's been other guys that they brought in, just were not at the same level as a guy like Calais Campbell and David Onyemata. Bringing those two guys in, what have they done to allow Grady Jarrett to play better ball perhaps this year, or has it been a little bit more? Obviously, the numbers aren't there right away. Pressures are there, but the numbers aren't there. What has hit their impact been on Grady Jarrett so far this season, and how has he looked compared to previous years?
I mean, Grady kind of always looks the same, which is why everybody here loves Grady. Is even amongst bad defensive lines, it never really seems to drag him down. He's usually going to be somewhere between 4.5 sacks on a bad year and like 7.5 sacks in a good year. But you kind of can plug him in and you're going to get production regardless. And that's a real testament to just the kind of worker he is, the type of attitude he brings week in and week out. Even when the games don't matter, he plays like they do. And I think that's why you saw really respected. I mean, there may not be a more respected in terms of just the veteran status, kind of the old sage in the NFL among defensive linemen as Calais Campbell. But David Onyemata comes in here with his former defensive line coach, who's now defense coordinator. And everybody says in training camp, this is Grady Jarrett's defense. You know, like this, we are looking at him first and foremost. And I think that's a great thing to see if you're Grady Jarrett, because it, I think, validates, not that he needs validation, I'm putting that word in his mouth, but it does kind of validate, all right, everything that I've done here, you know, it is being noticed, and that everybody is appreciative of the work, even if the record hasn't reflected that. In terms of how it's impacting him on the field, again, I think that what you're seeing that's a little bit different from what the Falcons have done previously is more of these gains on the defensive line. You're seeing stunts, twists, guys looping. And I think that's a little bit of a new factor for Grady. Grady has been really good as kind of a one-on-one, one-gap rusher. And so there's a little bit of a learning curve, but by and large, I think, and I've talked to David Onyemata about this, it's just the execution. They feel like they need to execute a little bit better because the pressure rate has been there. And so I think that's a big positive. You know, Grady's a great example of the pressure rate being there, the sacks kind of lagging behind. But even last week, there was a big moment on the broadcast. It was funny because Matt, again, was calling the game as the analyst, and Grady had a false start penalty. And Matt was like, man, you know, he doesn't make many of those. That's going to eat at him. I wouldn't be shocked if he does something to redeem himself on the next drive or whatever. And then the very next play, Grady gets the first sack of the game and kind of starts that 5-sack afternoon. And Matt was like, wow, didn't take long at all. I said the next drive, it was the next play. And so that's kind of the attitude, the fire. He's not going to stay down for long. You almost just wish that he had somebody like a Calais Campbell in the locker room from the start, because it's so impressive to see what he's done. But he never really did have that mentor, that kind of father figure, I think, in the locker room. And that would have been a cool pairing, but it's great to see him get that finally here. So it really is a full team effort. I mean, Bud Dupree, Arnold Ebiketie, you mentioned Calais Campbell, David Onyemata, Grady Jarrett. Those are the guys. But every one of them has been productive in his own way, and it's been a nice group effort so far alongside of Grady Jarrett.
All right, let's talk about this game a little bit more closely. The Bucs on offense, when they're on offense, where is the weakness on this Falcons defense that they should be attacking to move the ball down the field?
Yeah, I do think that you can have success if you do want to overload the box and if you do want to get the run game going. I think Tampa's offensive line would be able to certainly move the line of scrimmage a little bit. And it's just, I don't know if the Bucs have kind of that power run game in them. I haven't seen that and that's where, because what the Falcons like to do is you'll see it for like when the ball is snapped, almost the line of scrimmage, it starts, the Falcons have kind of two levels, right? As most defenses do. You've got the guys with their hand in the dirt, and then maybe the linebackers just behind them creeping up, filling those 2A gaps or whatever, like Minnesota like to do forever. And then that all compresses. Either it expands and dudes drop and that's part of the disguising coverage, or it compresses flat against the run and you get kind of this brick wall or gray wall effect. But if you can find that one gap, and if somebody does get moved or what have you, The second level defender is 5, 6, 7 yards down the field. And yeah, they're closing, but you get that crease of daylight. And that is an area where the Falcons, you know, when you look at the pass numbers and the run numbers are a little bit worse. It's because they have been hit for some of these big explosive runs. Usually they do a good job of stopping that before it becomes a 35, 40-yard run. But I think that the Bucs can move the ball on the ground if they are able to open up a little bit of a crease, because that second level defense can at times be right there on the front. The other thing is, I would just trust Mike Evans. Like this is of all the receivers, Mike Evans is the guy that I think has given AJ Terrell the most trouble throughout his career. And I mean, Michael Thomas has as well. So it's these bigger body receivers who can move, but I think Mike Evans is a better receiver than Michael Thomas. So I think that is going to be a matchup where if I'm Baker and we are throwing the ball and it is, you know, close or whatever, even though it's AJ Terrell, I'm looking at Mike Evans and I'm trusting that matchup.
Bucs fans hate hearing both of those things because so far they haven't been able to run the ball well at all. Those explosive plays haven't been there. They've actually had to run more of that dual gap power type of running scheme because they haven't been able to get that mid zone, outside wide zone kind of offensive run game going yet. It hasn't been clicking for them. Not everything is there. So they've had to fall back on what they know that they've ran last year with the duo gap and some power thrown in. So, you know, between that and Mike Evans and the Baker connection has been off. There has been drops by Evans, some bad throws by Baker. It's funny. I had the offensive coordinator, Dave Canales, on, and he said, you know, one of the biggest things I took away from that interview is they didn't have the quarterback competition throughout the summer until like the second to last week of when they named Baker the starter. Mm-hmm. And he said, you know, having that, it brings out the best. You have to see what you have in Kyle Trask. He was a second-round pick. He could have been phenomenal, but the flip point is now you're playing catch-up with snaps because you split them for so long. So now, you know, he's trying to catch up and continue to build that chemistry and camaraderie in the season. And so far, that's burned the Bucs on, you know, that Eagles game and that Lions game were more winnable than what the scores showed.
That Lions game was brutal, man. I know it got out of hand somewhat, but like that fourth quarter, those misses were bad.
Right. And you go into halftime, they're down like 10-3, you know, it's like you're still in this game. It's not like the game is over. Same thing with the Eagles game. It was like 10-3 at halftime. Like they missed plays and then, you know, getting the defense, not being able to convert on third down, defense gas, they're coming back out there and you're playing good offense. You can't do that. So that's not something the Bucs fans want to hear. The weakness for the Atlanta Falcons offense. What's Todd Bowles? What in your mind do you think Todd Bowles is going to do to exploit that offense, specifically Desmond Ridder, to try to get them to make some mistakes?
I think they're the common opponent that you all just played, that the Falcons played. Neither had much success against. I think the outcomes were pretty identical. The Lions had 7 sacks against Atlanta, and granted, that was in Detroit, but this is in Tampa. So the Falcons on the road against these defenses, that what really stuck out to me against Detroit's defense is from the jump, they not only looked like they knew exactly what Atlanta was trying to do, but that they were just so determined to overwhelm any Falcon player in their path. Like they were the more physical team. They were taking it to them. They were tenacious. They were just playing with like a violence that rarely do you see in the NFL one team clearly look more violent than the other. Like that's something you see on Saturday when Georgia's playing Vanderbilt. But I saw that in Detroit, and I feel like Tampa Bay is capable of doing something similar defensively. You know, Todd Bowles and this kind of proud defense that heard all offseason that Tampa was not going to be any good. And they're kind of like, all right, hey, what about us? Right? We are still here. We were here before Tom. We're here after Tom. And we can have a say in how the season goes as well. And I think you're going to see some blitzes. I think you're going to see a loaded box because I think that Tampa feels that their secondary is capable of hanging with Atlanta's passing game. Certainly, if you're able to heat up Desmond Ridder. So again, I would look at the game plan set out by Detroit, and they applied a lot of pressure on the Falcons, and then they heavily attacked the short area of the field, which is kind of similar to what Washington did as well. Is they knew that the Falcons were going to try to get the ball out quickly, and you saw Desmond Ridder have those turnovers. 2 of them were on passes kind of the flat or the short middle part of the field. So if the Bucs can play tight, they can play press and apply some pressure on Desmond Ridder pretty quickly. If you can take away the run game, it becomes hard to see a path to victory for Atlanta.
And the biggest thing for the taking away that run game is obviously having Vita Vea healthy. You look at the injury report today, Falcons are healthy. They have no one on the injury report this week. The Buccaneers, on the other hand, Anthony Nelson still battling through a concussion, was a full participant last week, full participant this week. We'll see if he's cleared going on to his second week. Really not sure when it developed because they had the bye week, so it could have been prior to that as well. So, he's a guy to look out for, but they have plenty of edge rush depth. The biggest thing is Vita Vea, limited practice with a foot yesterday rather. Today he did not practice. Is it a rest day? We'll find out more, I'm sure, tomorrow when, we talk to Coach Bowles and see if he's going to be able to go. But that would be a huge, huge loss in the ability for the Bucs to try to make this team one-dimensional. Because when Vita is healthy, this team has been one of the most dominant run defenses in the league. When he hasn't, with that Peck game against the Eagles, we saw what they're able to do. And this Falcons team is able to do something similar to what the Eagles did with their run game. But that's going to be a huge, huge play on it. If indeed the Saints keep sucking like they are against the Jacksonville Jaguars right now on Thursday Night Football, this really could come down for a battle for first place between these two teams on Sunday, which will make for some excellent football on top of everything. And speaking of that, let's get to it. Final thoughts, final score prediction. What do you got?
Yeah, I think that this is going to be a pretty tightly contested match. I think that we've seen that from Tampa Bay. Yeah, I know that the season finale last year, we can kind of throw that out the window because it was a weird game for everybody. But the first one down in Tampa, we all know how that ended. We don't have to rehash that, but that was a pretty tightly fought, competitive game. We, even when these teams were bad back at the last decade, early part of last decade, it didn't matter. These games were always kind of 24-27, 23-25, like weird scores like that. And so I'm kind of going in that vein. I think they are going to be feeling the pressure. I do think that this year the expectations are greater than maybe Tampa, even though they may be the same. I think the pressure is probably a little bit more because Tampa had that recent success in Atlanta. This is the year 3, all of that. So I expect a big week of practice from the Falcons. So I'm thinking, like 23-19, Atlanta gets the win on the road against Tampa.
Yeah. Are you going with Atlanta to save face, or are you going to Atlanta because you think that?
Of course I'm going. Of course I'm going with Atlanta.
Man, I picked against the Bucs against Detroit, and I do
think Atlanta needs to. I think they'll put together a good game, but again, I had such a hard time picking Washington, Atlanta, because I was like, either of these teams, it's almost like they're the same team. They're capable of having a great game and looking awesome, and they're capable of totally imploding. And both teams did exactly that in the same game at different points. So it's like. Right. The Falcons can implode just as much as they can go off.
It's been tough, with the Bucs, because I feel because the Eagles were just not playing Eagles football when they came in here week 3, and that was a game I looked at and that's a loss. But when you got to that game, I was like, well, I mean, the Bucs have been playing good throughout 2 weeks. The Falcons, the Eagles have not been playing very well. This could be a game they could win, and up until after halftime, it very much so looked like that. And, with Vita Vea banged up and then, Devin White banged up, having to run out of bounds instead of returning what he normally would, that interception as a pick 6, brings that game a lot closer. And you're like, oh, okay, this is more of a game. And then, even against the Saints, it's like, okay, Saints, They're in New Orleans though, and we both know how difficult that stadium is to play in. That's like a X factor in itself, but it's a close game. Every game that I've picked so far this season has been the Bucs in a close game, and they pretty much should have been that way, or won. Even last week, or potentially could have won. They've been evenly matched up, and I feel like this is another one of those games where I don't think the Bucs. You look at the Lions' loss, and you're like, oh well, they showed us their colors. I don't think that's the thing at all. I just think there was poor execution. I don't think any of those things are inherent flaws that are going to be like, you look at the team like, well, that's going to ruin their season. No, I think all those things are coachable, correctable, and teachable, fixable. But that being said, too, the Falcons have played really well. It's not one of these, you look at, I have this as a win. I had it as a win going into the season. I just don't trust Ritter. That's my biggest thing. I like what they did on defense. I know that running game is going to be strong. I don't like, not only that, I just don't like what Arthur Smith is doing with his passing game. I think he's wasting Kyle Pitts. I think he's not utilizing Drake London to his full abilities as well. Part of that is obviously the quarterback play. But I think you've got two studs there that you're not using to the best of their ability. That's just my opinion as an outsider.
A lot of people here would agree with you.
And I don't think they're there yet. I think they're probably, I don't want to say they're 2020 Bucs, a quarterback away. I think they're a quarterback and probably a few pieces away, but they've got a really young, talented team with some good veterans on there that if you put a Kirk Cousins on there, I think they win this division handily. I think if you're kind of looking at that type scenario, so if Kirk Cousins is a free agent next year, it's going to be interesting. But I still think they're on the cusp, and I think the Bucs have enough players who have been there, done that, and have more higher echelon talent on their roster than the Falcons. I mean, I got the this thing won't stay up for the life of me. I got the Falcons dropping this one in a close one because I don't think the Bucs have been able to pull away yet, and I don't know when their signature win is. I don't think it's this weekend. They still have yet to have one. And part of me thinks that this is going to be a sloppy game that they'll just narrowly edge out because of the looming shadow that is the Buffalo Bills on Thursday Night Football. And I don't think they're going to overlook this opponent, but there is that sense of pressure that we need to win against the Falcons before we go play the Bills up in Buffalo on Thursday Night Football in a short week. This is like a must-win, not a must, but like a must-win game for them, and that might be enough of a distraction to have them not focus fully. That should be a fun game no matter what.
I hope so. Yeah, they usually are, and even if this is an ugly game, the ugly games between the Bucs and the Falcons usually end up being pretty fun for one reason or another, even if it's not the score.
Right. Especially when Jameis is around.
Especially when Jameis is around.
Well, that's going to do it for us. We've been here for a minute, so we'll wrap it up here. Guys, you can catch Will at the Falcoholic. He's a writer for there. You can also catch him on the Believe podcast, Believe in Falcons. Anything else you got to promote? Anything you got to say before we wrap it up?
Nah, that's it. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Enjoy chopping it up. We'll get you back here. Maybe we can get Ovi with you too. A little 3-man pod here. We'll get you back here. I think, what is it? December 10th, I know is a date. I'm not sure what.
It's 12, 17. It's one of those two.
Something like that. But I'll be up in Atlanta, so we'll have to link up as well. So
oh yeah, of course.
With that being said, thank you again so much for popping on here, and we'll talk to you soon, man.
Anytime.
Awesome. All right, there you guys have it. Long episode today, but we got into it, chopping it up. You know me, I'm a rambler here over here, and when I get good conversation, I like to keep it going. So more content for you. Hooray! But that's gonna do it for us. We're gonna wrap it up here over at Pirate Parlay, brought to you by the Sick Podcast Network. We'll be back next week, short week, condensed week. So we'll have podcasts probably on Tuesday and Wednesday. We'll be recording Monday and Tuesday, so we'll drop them Tuesday, Wednesday before the game. I'm still working to see if we can get another surprise guest on here. With it being a short week, we might have to wait till the next week. You never know, though. Who knows? I might be able to work my magic here. But Anyways, you know it's going to be a banger of a podcast because we just put out bangers after bangers after bangers here at the Pirate Parlay podcast, brought to you by the Sick Podcast Network. We'll talk to you next week. We're out of here. Peace.
And that's a wrap. Hope you don't miss us too much until next time. Follow the Sick Podcast Pirate Parlay on YouTube, Facebook, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts.